Next two speakers I'll be introducing them. Benjamin Scolnic. Rabbi Ben is from the Northeast. He is our featured speaker tomorrow night. Teaches at Southern Connecticut State University, but is also a full-fledged, full-time family rabbi. I mean, he's got a synagogue. He cares for the families that are there. And he'll be speaking on the book of Daniel and modern theories about the persecution that led to the story of Hanukkah. And so those of us who are not Jewish will especially learn a good bit. And those of you who are Jewish still have something to learn from your rabbi, so pay attention. We'll follow Rabbi Ben with Gary Rinsberg, who will be speaking to us. Gary comes to us from Rutgers. Both of these gentlemen have been with us before. We're honored to have them back. Gary will be speaking on Septuagint, which is a label given to Greek translations of the Old Testament scriptures, synagogue, symbiosis, the Jews of Hellenistic Egypt. Both of these gentlemen will be their own timekeepers in a sense. I'll tell them how much time, but they've both got to get back in time for Sabbath, which starts at sundown, so they're on their own time clock to get back for that. And then our last will be Tom Davis, a good friend of our library and our efforts here, who will be speaking on Jews in Cyprus in Hellenistic times. Each of these gentlemen, world-recognized gurus in their area and what they'll be speaking on. So do you have your handouts? Are we ready to go? Then with that, I give you and I ask you to give me a warm Houston welcome to Rabbi Ben.
Celebrated Hanukkah, a festival of lights and miracles. A simplistic story was often told, and it went something like this. An evil Greek king by the name of Antiochus the Fourth, Epiphanes, thought that he was a god. Jews were killed for practicing their religion. A small band called the Maccabees fought a guerrilla war against the mighty Greek Empire, winning victory after victory until they regained their religious freedom. The Maccabees found the temple in Jerusalem polluted by pagan rites and restored it to the worship of the one God. Over 2,000 years later, Jewish people still celebrate Hanukkah, which means dedication, to remember that great victory and to cherish religious freedom. Comparisons are often made to the American Revolution. Now, this story is based on the apocryphal book of 1st Maccabees. Let's see if this is going to work. Good. And describes the Seleucid King Antiochus the Fourth's role in the persecution of Judaism in Judea in 168 BCE. The king wrote to all his kingdom for all to become one people and for each to abandon his own customs. Many Israelites accepted his religion and sacrificed to idols and violated the Sabbath. The king sent letters containing orders to violate Sabbaths and festivals, to defile temple and holy things, to leave their sons uncircumcised, so as to forget the Torah and violate all the commandments. Whoever disobeyed the word of the king was put to death. Now, even among skeptical scholars, there is no doubt that these events occurred. Here is Shia Cohn. What provoked the persecution by Epiphanes remains an enigma, in spite of intense study by many scholars, but a persecution there was. And the war it provoked is history's first recorded struggle for religious liberty. As for historicity, Seth Schwartz says, there can be no doubt about the main claim that Antiochus issued and enforced decrees against the practice of Judaism. So everybody agrees that there was a persecution. There are several modern explanations for the persecution. The most important view of the traditional version is that of the Israeli scholar Victor Cherikover, who reconstructs the series of events leading to the persecution in a different way. In other words, everybody agrees that there was a persecution, but why? And what's bothering everybody is that this was a polytheist. King Antiochus the Fourth was a polytheist who worshipped many gods. Why would he persecute any religion for anything? His father, King Antiochus III, had a decree where it was like an edict of tolerance for everybody. All of his predecessors had done the same thing. Why all of a sudden is there this anomaly? So Cherikover says the following. It was not the revolt which came as a response to the persecution, but the persecution which came as a response to the revolt. Only on this assumption can we understand Antiochus' decrees and their political purpose. The Jewish faith was faced not after Antiochus' decree, but before it, with the alternative of renouncing its existence or fighting for its life. So what Cherikover is doing is rearranging the sequence. He's saying that after Antiochus sent Syrian troops to Jerusalem and formed a military colony in the Acra, those troops used the temple for their worship and opened the temple to polytheistic citizens of the new Greek Jerusalem. A conservative group, the Hasidians, saw all this as a desecration of the temple and rebelled. Now, a weakness of Cherikover's hypothesis, in my view, is that, again, he changes the sequence of events. First, Maccabees says that the persecution was the cause, not the result of the revolt. Cherikover rearranges the sequence to explain this anomaly of why Antiochus the Fourth initiated a religious persecution. It may not be a coincidence that Cherikover was an Israeli scholar, and he sees the Maccabees as the forerunners of the modern Israelis, fighting for freedom from persecution and independence. He may have seen a reflection of his time and his place in the 160s BCE. The prevailing modern view is that of Elias Bickerman, the greatest scholar of the Hellenistic world, and he claims that First Maccabees, for one, is just historically false. The impetus for the persecution came not from Antiochus the Fourth, he wouldn't have done this, but from the Jewish Hellenists, led by the high priest Menelaus, who wanted to change the very nature of Judaism. These Jewish Hellenists, Bickerman says, wanted to assimilate into the Greek world by getting rid of the Jewish identifying mark of circumcision and the other particularistic Jewish rites and rituals. These Jewish people, Bickerman says, put Antiochus up to the persecution. He didn't really have any interest in changing the religious beliefs and practices of his subjects. Menelaus received military aid from Antiochus IV that developed into the religious persecution. It was a civil war. It wasn't a revolution. It was a civil war between different groups of Judeans. Since it was not Antiochus IV, but Jewish leaders who were the instigators of the religious persecution, this whole problem, this whole anomaly of why Antiochus IV was a religious persecutor is just removed. Now, this alternate version is derived from a selective reading of a different apocryphal book, Second Maccabees, which is not what it sounds like, a sequel to First Maccabees, but a different account of many of the same events. A weakness of Bickerman's position, in my view, is that it must discard the clear statement that we saw of First Maccabees 1, passages in Second Maccabees, which I'm about to tell you, and as I will emphasize, passages in the biblical book of Daniel. Since Bickerman bases himself on Second Maccabees, it is instructive to see that Second Maccabees 5 explicitly states that Antiochus was angry over the revolt in Judea and massacred its inhabitants, and that Second Maccabees 6:1 states that I'm sorry, I went too far. But sent Gairon the Athenian to compel the Jews, I can't see it in the sun, I don't know what it says, to something to their ancestral laws and to cease living by the something, and also to defile. Anyway, what it's saying is that King Antiochus IV sent somebody to do this persecution. So why does Bickerman say that Antiochus IV didn't do the persecution and there was the Jewish Hellenists? Why does he disregard passages in First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, and as I'll show you, the book of Daniel? I don't know, but Bickerman was a European Jewish man who saw the assimilation of Jewish people, saw different Jewish groups in modern European countries, and maybe he saw a reflection of his time and place in the 160s BCE. In other words, I'm trying to say something about scholarship. You have to know who the scholar is. The scholar is asking questions in a certain way that reflect the questions of his time. Klaus Bringmann, good, it says that we shouldn't think that King Antiochus IV persecuted the Jews because they wouldn't abandon their religion. Instead, his motives were only political and economic, and I'm going to just summarize this. He says that Menelaus was bringing in the money, and so he wanted to defend Menelaus, and so he officially issued the edict, but the onus is no longer on Antiochus the Fourth at all, but on the Jewish priest Menelaus. And a weakness of this hypothesis, in my view, is that in these different passages, the persecution of Judaism always precedes the establishment of the pagan altar in the temple, and that it doesn't say that Menelaus was the one who was the persecutor. Now, the latest scholarly fad is to shift the blame of the persecution from Antiochus IV to his own advisors and generals. The Seleucid Empire was huge, and in a kingdom as geographically huge as the Seleucid realm, we shouldn't think that a king would be concerned for one minute, one way or another, about a religion of the little land of Judea. In the most comprehensive recent study, Mittag states that the origins of the persecution are to be found in the interplay between Seleucid officials and Jewish groups. Antiochus' role was limited. Again, all of these theories fly in the face of the passages involved, and they all take the persecutor label away from Antiochus IV. So the question remains, why would a religious persecution be the response to a political uprising? That's where the discussion is today. All of these theories are valuable. All of them advance the discussion. All of them are brilliant. But they all seek to avoid the problem of a polytheist who persecutes a foreign people for their worship of their own religion in their own land. Antiochus IV's persecution of Judaism in Judea in the 160s BCE remains the most perplexing enigma in Hellenistic and Jewish history. The question remains, I'm going to say it again, why have a religious persecution be the response to a political uprising? So, I'm working on a new theory, and this is audacious of me, after all of these brilliant men have tried. And my attempt is to utilize a source always neglected by all of these interpretations, and that is the biblical book of Daniel, which absolutely condemns Antiochus IV for instigating the persecution and states why and when. Now, why do none of these scholars talk about the book of Daniel? I'm not sure. Maybe it's prejudice against the Bible. Maybe it's not thinking the Bible is a historical source. I don't know. I just know that the references to the book of Daniel in all of their works are few and far between, when actually the book of Daniel gives us a detailed account of the persecution. And I also insist that we should study Antiochus IV's career before the persecution. Knowing his biography, like knowing anybody's biography, reveals a lot about the person. And it reveals in this case that Antiochus did not instigate the first religious persecution in history, which is what everybody is saying, but imitated a violent religious persecution to which he himself was a first-hand witness. Knowing his biography can lead us to an understanding of why he did what he did, and this view will fit perfectly with what the book of Daniel says. The Antiochian persecution must be seen in a context. It's in the context of the rise of Antiochus IV and his need for power and money that caused the rise and fall of the high priest Jason in Judea and the rise of the high priest Menelaus in Judea. And so if we study Daniel, especially chapter 11, verses 20 through 24, and other extra-biblical evidence, we may be able to provide a political and economic context for all of these enigmatic events. Now today, very quickly, I can only present a quick outline of a reconstruction of this context. Since what I'm going to be saying is going to seem very different than the usual theories, I just want to tell you that I have published detailed articles on I think, all of the matters I'm going to be talking about. So, here's Daniel 11:21. Let me give you the background. Here's the historical background that we're going to need. From 192 to 188 BCE, Antiochus IV's father, Antiochus III, waged war against the ascendant Roman Republic. He lost. And under the stipulations of the treaty, Antiochus III was forced to retreat, pay annual tribute of 1,000 talents, and send hostages to Rome. His son, our nemesis, the future Antiochus IV, became the principal hostage in Rome for 12 years, from 187 to 175. Even after his father died and his older brother Seleucus the Fourth became the king, they left him in Rome. Now, why is this so strange? If you would know about the Seleucid kingdom, you would know that princes were always used as big administrators, as viceroys. They had huge positions. They were commanders of armies. And to leave him in Rome is to scorn him. And indeed, Daniel 11:21 says, "There will stand in his place a scorned man who was not given the splendor of royalty, and he will come and take the kingdom, the kingship, with schemes." So that's what Daniel says, and it is absolutely correct. Antiochus the Fourth is cooling his heels for 12 years in Rome, waiting to get back, waiting for a position, doesn't get it. Finally, he has something to do with the assassination of his older brother, Seleucus the Fourth, and he comes back with a vengeance, but there's a problem. And the problem is that Seleucus the Fourth, his older brother, had a couple of sons, and one of them's name was Antiochus, just to get you even more confused. And so there's this little boy, and we have his coins, this little boy named Antiochus, who is the rightful heir to the throne, and our guy, Antiochus the Fourth, is just the uncle of the king, who has never held a big position in the kingdom, but he wants to be king. And so he comes in with the help of Rome and Pergamon and a couple of other forces, and he comes in, and he is very appreciative of what Rome has done for him. When he was in Rome, he loved Rome. And all of the things that you see on your screen, he would wear a toga. He ran for office, even though he didn't have any office to run for. He sat in a Roman chair. He reviewed the soldiers in triumphal processions. He loved gladiators. He employed Roman architects. And there are more very specific pieces of evidence to show that he loved Rome. And he even said at one point, "You treated me like a prince, not like a hostage." And this is while his own family was leaving him there. So, for all of the theories that I told you about, I didn't tell you about another one by Jonathan Goldstein, may he rest in peace, which has been discarded and rejected by just about everybody. And even Goldstein himself, towards the end of what turned out to be the end of his life, sort of made modifications. But he had this very important point. The years during which the future Antiochus IV was in Rome were epoch-making in the history of the development of Roman civic and religious institutions. Antiochus IV modeled his persecution, Goldstein says, on the persecution of the Bacchants, Bacchus Dionysus in Rome, when he was a hostage there in the 180s BCE. For Goldstein, and I think he's right, the most important event for understanding why Antiochus IV persecuted Judaism was that the Roman Senate conducted a persecution as a response to the growing popularity of the Dionysian cult that it saw as undermining of and as a challenge to the very meaning of political existence within the Republic. Livy informs us that the rapid spread of the Bacchic cult, which he claims indulged in all kinds of crimes and political conspiracies at its secret meetings, led in 186 BCE to a decree by which the Bacchanalia, and remember these are religious rites, and this is a religious group, they were prohibited not only in Rome but throughout all Italy, which was really a foreign country. According to Livy, the measures against the Bacchants, the Bacchic cult, were conducted over a span of 5 years, so this wasn't just one little massacre, took the lives of 7,000 people, the majority through execution. They were being executed for living lives in their religion, caused great terror inside and outside of the city, numerous suicides, and a mass flight of these people from Rome. And according to Cicero, the measures even included military attacks on the group. Now, the Roman Senate's decision to suppress the Bacchanalia in 186 BCE constituted, as far as I know, and I'm hoping that my friends, the other scholars, will help me and give me other parallels, but as far as I know, constituted the largest systematic persecution of a religious group to that point in history, at least as I know it. While Hume and others always insist that there's a strong interrelationship between monotheism and religious persecution, I think that polytheistic societies may have been quite capable of systematic religious exclusion and persecution. In Rome, religion and the state were one. It was a civic religion. And as Livy presents it, this new Dionysian religion could have become a second political power that would undermine family and class and gender distinctions. The Senate may have seen the Bacchanalia as a religious revolution, the formation of a religious organization on the basis of a new principle for religions of individual membership. The situation may have been seen as a collision of two forms of religiosity, the religiosity of the Roman state cult that fostered the political community, and the apolitical religiosity, which was often orgiastic, of the worshippers of Bacchus Dionysus that promoted the fulfillment of the physical individual and his or her desires. Those who know the history of early Christianity in Rome will start to see some parallels. In short, Antiochus learned that religion can be politically problematic. So it's fair to conclude we have every right to think that Antiochus the Fourth took all of this in. He was there at the time and watched over those 5 years a religious persecution. He had come to Rome not as a child, but as an adult who could integrate his experiences in sophisticated ways. He was an extremely ambitious man, a smart and crafty survivor who was skilled in warfare and diplomacy. It is at least plausible that he integrated aspects of his experience in Rome into the view of how the power of a state can be applied when you need it. Now, the Roman historian Appian says that Antiochus finally came back after 12 years as a hostage to Antioch, the capital of the kingdom, after his older brother Seleucus the Fourth was assassinated in 175. And he says, afterward, on the death of Antiochus the Great, that's his father, his older brother, that's Seleucus the Fourth, succeeded him and gave his son, that's a guy named Demetrius, you don't have to remember that, as a hostage to the Romans in place of his brother, that's Antiochus the Fourth. When the latter arrived at Athens on his way home, Seleucus was assassinated as the result of a conspiracy of a certain Heliodorus, one of the court officers. And everybody wants to know, historians want to know, why did Heliodorus, who, by the way, was like a foster brother to Seleucus the Fourth, they'd grown up together. He had the most important position in the kingdom next to the king. Why did he assassinate the king? Well, if they read their Bibles, they would know. Because Daniel 11:20 says, his place, that is Antiochus III, will be taken by one who will dispatch an officer to exact tribute for royal glory, but he will be broken in a few days, not by wrath or by war. In other words, he was assassinated. Daniel 11:20 is prophesying the assassination of Seleucus IV, which is a historical event, as we know from that passage in Appian. So why does Heliodorus do this? And what we can understand is that Seleucus IV was just gathering money. He wasn't doing wars, he wasn't building, he was just gathering money, and there was resistance. And that resistance is seen in 2 Maccabees 3. You've seen the painting of horses, coming and whipping a guy. That's a famous painting about this scene, how Heliodorus came to Jerusalem. And the way I take it is that this supernatural epiphany can be read as Heliodorus' culminating realization that this is no good, that this king is going to create a revolution among all of the countries. And so Heliodorus and his guys assassinated him and put this little boy, Seleucus the Fourth's son, Antiochus, as king. The only thing is it backfired on Heliodorus because these guys are thugs, right? These guys they were terrible, evil thugs. These kingdoms, these Hellenistic states were just corporations, and all they cared about was money and bringing in the money, and they would kill anybody and do anything. But the worst guys were the guys at the top, who were always busy killing each other and poisoning and doing all sorts of things like that. So this Heliodorus, as Appian says, when he sought to possess himself of the government, in other words, he was going to become the regent to this little boy king, he was driven out by Eumenes and Attalus. They are the king and crown prince of Pergamon, who installed Antiochus, that's our guy, therein in order to secure his goodwill. So now Antiochus IV is the regent. Now, there's a big difference between being a regent and being the king. The boy, the rightful heir, Antiochus, this little boy, is still the king, and Antiochus IV is the regent, but that's not good enough. He doesn't care that he's ruling the kingdom. He wants to be king, and even though this boy is his nephew, he's not satisfied. And so what he does, he goes on this quiet campaign, and Daniel 11 is going to give us a few verses. I'll give those to you in a minute. I'm just giving you the context. That he had to rise to power. This boy had the establishment on his side. They liked him because they could control him. But Antiochus IV wanted to be king, but he needed to bide his time. He had to get stronger and stronger, and he needed lots of money in order to do it. So now I'm going to read you these verses in Daniel, so I can show you the succession, how it lays it all out. Again, I've read this verse before. I'm going to read it again. There will stand in his place a scorned man, that's Antiochus IV, who was not given the splendor of royalty. In other words, they didn't let him do anything. And he will come, as he did, and take the kingship with schemes. He did not become king very quickly. It took years. The forces of the flood, this is Daniel 11:22, including the prince with whom he made a compact, that's this little boy that I keep talking about, who's the king, will be overwhelmed and broken by him. 11:23, and from the time an alliance is made with him, he will practice deceit, and he will rise to power with a small nation. Now, this guy would do anything, this Antiochus the Fourth. So what he does is he marries the mother of the boy, who's like the queen mother. He marries her, and they have a child together. And so he waits for a few years till this child, his natural heir, would be able to be king if he were killed, and then he assassinates his nephew. And 11:24, he will invade the richest of provinces unawares. All of scholarship says Antiochus was the king already when he came. It's not true. Daniel 11 has it right. It took him years to gather the strength, and will do what his father and forefathers never did, lavishing on them spoil, booty, and wealth. He will have designs upon strongholds, but only for a time. So Daniel 11:21 through 24 is right. He became regent in 175. He married the boy king's mother, and he intrigued, and he plotted, and he put his friends in positions of power. And he may not have become co-king. He may have become co-king in 172, but it was not sole king until 170, 169. Now you say, how do you know that? So, okay, so you believe in the Bible. You believe that the Bible is truth. You believe that the Bible is historical. We have good historical evidence to corroborate everything I was just saying. And we have coins. Coins are a wonderful segment of evidence because they are officially minted by the state. And we see pictures of this boy. We have no less than 12 different coins from no less than 4 different cities and at least 19 different moneyers that represent the kingship and legitimate succession of the boy King Antiochus, son of Seleucus the Fourth. He must have been king for several years. We also have Babylonian evidence. The astronomical diary corroborates the idea that Antiochus the Fourth was not sole king until 170 or 169. The Babylonian king list even differentiates between the date of the execution of Antiochus, son of Seleucus the Fourth, in 170, and the sole kingship of Antiochus the Fourth in 169. So it took him years to become the king, something the scholarship does not recognize. But the book of Daniel has it, and it has it in 3 different places. And one of them is a passage that I bet a lot of you know from Daniel 7 about the horns, the beasts with the horns. And here's Daniel 8, that Antiochus was impudent and versed in intrigue, who will destroy the mighty and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning, he will use deceit successfully. He will make great plans, will destroy many, taking them unawares. So you've got extra biblical evidence to corroborate what the Bible is saying. Now, what does this have to do with our main subject? Jason was the high priest. But let me go back a minute, because a couple of the other lectures touched on this. There was a guy named Onias III, really great high priest. There are passages about him in different things. An upright, outstanding high priest. Had a younger brother named Jason. Jason wanted to be high priest. Jason goes to Antiochus, who was on the make. He was trying to make money. And Jason says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I can get more taxes and temple vessels and things like that out of Judea. I'll give them to you so you can bribe people, so you can rise to power. Antiochus the Fourth, as regent, says, you're in, right? Onias III goes to Antioch in exile, and Jason becomes high priest, but he didn't get him enough money. So in 172, Jason, who's in trouble because he's not getting him enough money, sends an associate named Menelaus up to Antioch to talk to Antiochus and to say, the check's in the mail. The money's coming. Don't worry. But Menelaus doesn't do that because he's a thug too. And he says to Antiochus, make me high priest and I'll get you the money that Jason didn't get you. And so now Menelaus becomes the high priest. So the gradual rise of Antiochus during those years provides the political context for the rise and fall of Jason and the rise of Menelaus in Judea. Antiochus the Fourth, I'm just repeating what I just said, replaces Onias III with his brother Jason as the high priest of Judea because Jason promises the kinds of sons Seleucus the Fourth had sought. Antiochus the Fourth gradually replaces supporters of Heliodorus and the young king Antiochus with those more loyal to him, such as several Milesians. I have a whole article just about that, how Daniel nailed this, that it knows exactly who his associates were, and with those who promised him even more money, such as Jason in 175-74 and Menelaus in 172. Okay, now comes a big scene. Antiochus is now the king. It's 169. He's knocked off his nephew, which is really not very nice. And he invades Egypt. His idea is that Rome is involved with the Macedonian kingdom. When Alexander the Great died, all sorts of things happened, but eventually there were three great kingdoms. The Seleucids based in Syria and Babylonia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and the Antigonids up in Macedonia. Well, the Romans were fighting the Antigonids. While they were busy fighting them, Antiochus, who's now king, on his own, the boy is dead, goes and invades Egypt and conquers it. And what he does is he sets his nephew, because they're all interrelated, another nephew, in power. But this nephew has the nerve to sort of care about Egypt or something like that. And so he gets together with his sister and brother, and they throw off the idea that they're going to be vassals to their uncle. So he invades again in 168, and now comes this big scene. It's called the Day of Eleusis. This may sound familiar to you. Antiochus is at the gates of Alexandria, the last place in Egypt he has to conquer. He's on the beach, and a few Roman ships come up from Cyprus. My friend Tom and I have an article just about this aspect of things. And this guy, Popilius Linnaeus, gets off the ship. And by the way, this is in all sorts of sources, in Polybius and Livy and all sorts of things, exactly the way I'm going to tell you. He gets off the ship, and he draws a circle with his walking stick around Antiochus the Fourth and says, you have to decide. Either you leave Egypt right now. I know you've conquered it twice, but either you leave right now, or I'm bringing Rome down on you because we won that war against the Macedonians. We're not busy anymore. We're coming after you. And I think, even though I can't prove this, that he's got, if you can follow this, Seleucus the Fourth's other son, Demetrius, as a hostage in Rome. If they send him back, he's the true heir, because Antiochus the Fourth was only the brother of the king. So Antiochus the Fourth has this problem, right? He's on the beach. There's a circle around him. He's, look, I'd like to have a board meeting, right? I want to talk to my guys. He says, no, you can't walk out of, I'm not making this up. You think the Bible's imaginative? I mean, really. He says, you cannot talk to your guys. You have to decide. He says, well, in that case, I guess I'll leave. So he leaves. After conquering Egypt, and this is his history. We have all sorts of sources. He leaves. But he's angry. And he's worried because he has this kingdom that goes from Judea to Afghanistan. And power is the perception of power. In a kingdom that's that far flung, if they hear that he's been humiliated by the Romans, he's done for. Because none of them want to be part of the Seleucid kingdom. They're not loyal to it. Everybody wants to have their own state and their own control. And so it's a dramatic humiliation, and he's got to do something because this humiliation threatens the perception of his power in his own kingdom. It's at that moment that something happens. Remember Jason. Jason was the younger brother of Onias III, the high priest, who had then been thrown out because he didn't get enough money. Well, Jason has been cooling his heels in the Transjordan, and he's been gathering up a force, just waiting for a moment to come back and to become high priest again against Menelaus. So he hears a rumor. Remember, they didn't have the internet. He hears a rumor that Antiochus the Fourth has been killed by the Romans in Egypt. He believes it because that was the news. That was on CNN, the Canaanite News Network or something like that. And so he marches on Jerusalem with 1,000 guys, and they have a bloody coup in Jerusalem, and Antiochus the Fourth is not dead. As a matter of fact, he's in Egypt, coming back to Syria, and guess what? He's going to pass by Judea. Israel's always had the wonderful fortune of being in the middle of everything, just when you didn't want to be in the middle of everything. And he has these thoughts. He remembers what the Romans did. What the Romans did was to use religious persecution for political gain. He had integrated that. And now he's got a reason. Now, the Jews are known for one thing throughout the Hellenistic world, that they're strict and loyal adherents to their religion. If I can knock them out of their religion, everybody's going to go, whoa, he's not humiliated. He's the man. We're going to stay part of this kingdom. We're not messing with this guy. And indeed, Daniel 11 says, everything that I just said, at the appointed time he will return and he will come to the south, but the second time will not be like the first time, and the ships of Cyprus will come back with him, but he will be driven out, and he will return raging against the holy covenant. Daniel had it right. He was humiliated, and he was raging, but he couldn't do anything to the Romans. So, this is what bullies do. When you can't take on somebody your own size, you take on somebody smaller. So, in so doing, he uses that model that he'd learned in Rome, of the persecution of the Bacchants that he'd personally witnessed while a hostage in Rome. So I'm really sticking to the time thing. Here's my conclusion. Antiochus the Fourth learned in Rome that a religious persecution can be a weapon in the arsenal of political power. Jason's rebellion in 168, motivated by rumors of Antiochus' death, but really at the moment of his political humiliation, was a pretext for a demonstration of such power. For all of the modern theories that I told you, the Bible knew this thousands of years ago. Thank you.